مساء الخير واهلا وسهلا بكم اعزائي المشاهدين. For those of you who don't speak Arabic, it's good evening and welcome our dear participants and attendees. And for those of you on the West Coast, good afternoon. And for those of you in Europe, almost good night at this point. My name is Akram Khatir. I'm a professor of history here at North Carolina State University, and I'm also the director of the Kharala Center for Lebanese Diaspora Studies, also at North Carolina State University. On behalf of the Kharala Center, I would like to welcome you tonight to our conversation with award-winning Arab-American filmmaker Mike Mosallam. We hope that you will enjoy this event with us, which will be the 9th webinar that we hold as part of our Turath or Heritage series. But first, I would like to introduce the Kharala Center to all those of you. Oops, sorry. So again, for the Moise Kharala Center for Lebanese Diaspora Study is dedicated to research about Lebanese immigrants to the United States and throughout the world, and to preserving and sharing that knowledge with the scholarly community and general public. To do so, we have continue to build a large archive, and we tell stories based on that archive. So whether it is letters, film, photographs, audio recordings, video recordings, books, newspapers, any kind of material that pertains to the history of the Lebanese immigrant and diaspora community from the late 19th century all the way through now. We have undertaken the preservation of that material, and then we use that to do documentaries, exhibits, workshops, publish various publications, as well as do various digital humanities projects. And you're welcome to visit us at lebanestudies.ncsu.edu, and I'm going to put the link here for those of you, lebanestudies.ncsu.edu, and you can join us there. You can also follow us on social media at whether it's Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook, and please feel free to do so, and we would welcome you in this regard. Now, here is kind of my shameless plug for support. Far too often, cultural institutions in this country and really throughout the world are starved of funding. And I would encourage you tonight, as you are participating in this webinar and joining us, and in the series of webinars that we have hosted, to support us in any way you can. You can take your ubiquitous mobile phone, point your camera at the QR code that you see on your screen, and just click, and it will take you to our donation website. And really, like anything else, including with NPR, your $5, $10, $25, or $50 would be very helpful support for us at this and in every month that you can. Thank you again for your support. Before I go on to introduce Mike, I would like to introduce the Turath exhibit, as well as the Turath webinar series. For those of you who have joined us before, you will have heard the spiel, so I apologize for the repetitive nature of it. But for those of you who are joining us for the first time, let me introduce you to Turath. Turath is an Arabic word that means heritage. And in 2020, the centennial year, 100 years after the establishment of the first Arab-American Literary Society in New York City by Gibran Khalil Gibran, Elia Abu Madi, Abdul Masih Haddad, and Qayyim al-Aini, and various other early Arab-American writers. This early Arab-American Literary Society was called Al-Rabita Al-Qalamiyya, very awkwardly translated as the Pen League, and its purpose was to promote Arab-American literature. Well, in 2020, to celebrate the centenary, the 100 years anniversary of that, we decided to develop an exhibit. Originally, it was going to be a physical exhibit touring the United States, but then COVID hit us like it hit everybody, and we shifted to a virtual exhibit. And you can find this virtual exhibit at turath2020.org. I'm putting it in the chat. Sorry. And the exhibit itself celebrates early Arab-American culture, and it narrates the stories of early Arab-American entrepreneurs, musicians, writers, painters, newspaper people, performers, you name it. We have for the first time, and in one location, we're able to put together this exhibit to celebrate them and to honor their memory. At the same time, we wanted to, if you will, continue the narrative arc from the early 1920s to 2020, and we initiated a series of webinar conversations with contemporary Arab-American artists, writers, those who are in theater, in dance, in music, in art. And tonight, of course, we are very privileged and honored to have with us an award-winning Arab-American filmmaker, Mike Mosallam. So allow me at this point to introduce Mike. And I would remind those of you who are new to webinars that in a webinar format, your camera and your audio are automatically off. If you have questions, and we will have time for a lot of your questions, and I hope you will participate actively, please use the Q&A functions that you will see in the bar at the bottom of your screen. Again, not the chat, but the Q&A. And I will be certain to read your questions and share them with Mike. Now, Mike Mosallam is a producer, director, writer for theater, film, and television. Through his production company, Mike Mosallam Productions, he and his team produce short films, such as Breaking Fast, which premiered at the Cannes Film Festival, and Brothers, 12-time jury and audience award winner, both written and directed by Mike, along with a short film, Ubuntu, a co-production with the Muslim Public Affairs Council. His feature film debut, Breaking Fast, based on the short film that he had made earlier in 2015, had its world premiere at the CineQuest Film Festival in March 2020, and its Los Angeles premiere shortly thereafter at Outfest Fusion. After playing more than 65 festivals worldwide and winning major awards, it was acquired for distribution by Vertical Entertainment and released on Hulu, Apple TV, iTunes, Amazon, and anywhere else you can buy or rent movies on demand. So I would encourage you to very much watch the film. It's a remarkable film, actually. He is the creator and co-executive producer of the critically acclaimed TLC series, All American Muslim. Most recently, Mike was an executive director consultant on season 2 of Hulu's Rami, episode 9. He is currently writing his second feature, loosely based on a true story. On the theater side, Mike has produced and directed more than 100 theatrical productions, from large-scale musicals, intimate cabaret settings, plays, concerts, and multimedia theatrical events. He is a proud Muslim, Lebanese American, and fluent in Arabic. Mike is represented by the Gersh agency, Echo Lake Entertainment, and Granderson de Rocher LLP. Welcome, Mike. And now what I would like to do is share with our audience a little collage of Mike's films, and then we'll turn after that. Mike and I will start our conversation. And again, I would really encourage you at that point to share with us all your questions so that Mike can have a chance to answer them. Go here, and we'll go.
New, start fresh.
You know I can't work out, Jordan.
Don't let last year define who you are this year. Start new, start fresh.
You know I can't work out, Jordan, Ramadan. I'm just not in the mood to be around happy people.
This is Cal. This is Mo, my best friend. He's a doctor. Did I mention he's a single doctor?
I'm not jinx this thing. That isn't even a thing.
So you are interested?
I'm not saying that.
When are you gonna snap out of this horrible funk you've been in? It's been nearly a year. How often are you two breaking fast?
I don't know. Like every night?
Every night?
You mean to tell me your immigrant mother would allow you to be like this and have no opinion about it?
My immigrant mother is nothing like what you see on TV.
What I know is that a gay Arab Muslim guy in WeHo probably knows what it's like to have people make assumptions about him. You always spin things in a way that ignores what's wrong. I like you. What do you like about me?
Be open. Be honest.
I'm scared. You deserve to be loved.
Yeah, see, I'm not such a mystery.
All right. And I apologize. I thought I put the collage of the films, but it was actually the trailer for Breaking Fast, the feature-length film. So I apologize for that little technical error, and I will just ascribe it to the fact that we are living in COVID fog. So my apologies about that. Mike, again, welcome, and thank you so much for taking the time to be with us this afternoon for you, of course.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Ahla sahla. And I see somebody was in the chat. Let's see. Hi. So, today's conversation is really about your life and your work. So I really would like to start very simply with, if you would tell us a little bit about your own background, growing up in a Lebanese American family as a Muslim in the United States, and just really kind of, the story of immigrants, if you will. That would be very pertinent to our audience.
Sure, of course. I grew up in a town that most people who have any wherewithal of Arab America know, called Dearborn, Michigan. I am the fourth child and of immigrant parents, both of whom came to the United States from Lebanon, particularly the south of Lebanon. My mother and father both worked tirelessly throughout the course of their lives. Ali Rahma, my mother has now passed. My father is still alive in his 80s and still insists on going to work, although we don't know why, but he insists because that's just sort of built into the fiber of his being. Growing up in Dearborn was phenomenal for me. I loved the intersectionality of McDonald's that served halal food, of school systems that were built around the Muslim holiday calendars, and things of that nature that sort of, when I left Dearborn, I didn't realize was so unique to what it really meant to be Arab American in this country. I think so often we hear of Arab stories, Arab American stories, and they're generally fish out of water stories. They're people who are experiencing America through the eyes of being the other. And in Dearborn, growing up in Dearborn, the other is everybody. And so, I had experiences. I didn't realize my otherness until I moved out of Dearborn, out of that kind of bubble, and went to college in a less homogenous town, moved to New York eventually, and sort of really lived the breadth of diversity that exists there. But my parents were and are middle class, very, very hardworking, instilled huge values of work ethic and education in myself and my siblings, and those stand true to me today. And so when I was in high school and I went home and I told my parents that I was going to major in musical theater, they appropriately found, the nearest shahata to throw at me, and had some issues with that. But, ultimately they didn't stand in my way just because they didn't understand it. They just were like, we got to figure out what this kid's going to do, and so he's not on our payroll for the rest of his life. And then I went to the University of Michigan. I majored in musical theater, moved to New York in the year 2001. We know what happened to Arabs/Muslims in New York in 2001, so I promptly left. I got a more sustainable degree. I got a degree in teaching, was miserable. Went back and got another degree in musical theater, and then started my career as a director of theater, a producer of theater, and then transitioned into film. And now I have been in LA for the last 10 years and work in entertainment, and have only ever worked in entertainment, thank God. So here I am.
Well, it's an amazing story, but I do want to really unpack it a little bit more if we can,
Sure.
before we start shifting to talking about theater and film and what got you interested in that. So as a center, obviously we are very focused on the immigrant story, especially from folks from Lebanon. And I'm kind of curious, as we unpack this a little bit, your parents' story sounds remarkable, and certainly it's something that is very familiar. But one of the things I wanted to ask about, Dearborn, as you said, is an enclave with a lot of Americans, especially from Lebanon, where you walk down the street and you are basically seeing things that are very familiar, smells that are very familiar, as if it's a street in Saida or some places other. And for those members of the audience who didn't get the reference to shahata, shahata is the Lebanese Arabic word for slipper, or flip-flop. So throwing that is kind of the stereotypical Arab parent way of getting at your child approach. So growing up, I mean, obviously you grew up in that enclave. What was your relationship to Lebanon? I mean, were you You grew up here, obviously you were born here, but what about the relationship to Lebanon?
Yeah, it's a good question. I had a very oppositional relationship between my parents. My father, who goes back every year consistently, has gone back at least once a year, spends a couple weeks a year there, with the exception of last year for obvious reasons. And that really has taken its toll on him emotionally. I have a lot of relatives still in Lebanon, mostly on my father's side. And when my mother left, I want to say maybe in the 50s, 60s, she never went back. Even later in life, when she made her pilgrimage to Mecca and had the opportunity to go back, she couldn't. And I think something that was very unspoken in my house was the traumas of war and the traumas that existed for my parents' generation. So my father had a total love affair with Lebanon and continued to go back and continues to go back. And my mother not at all. So it was I didn't go my first visit to Lebanon, even though we were culturally very Lebanese and were very enmeshed in a Lebanese American experience, wasn't until I was 30.
Wow.
And that was the first time I could go. My father had talked about taking us with him on his trips, but my mother was just insistent that we not go. She was very afraid.
And what was your impression when you first went back? And where did you go back to, I suppose is the question.
I primarily was in Beirut. My father has a home in Beirut that I stayed in, and it's a very, I'm sure you and some of the audience watching knows, going back as a person with family there, it's not like you can go and just like tour the streets and do what you want, but it's like house to house of people that you've never met or that have heard about or talked on the phone. Or I don't know if this is true for you, but I grew up, we would sort of make tape recordings and then send them off into the ether, and they would, magically appear on the other side of the world. So it was, it wasn't, that first trip was really like a lot of meeting a lot of strangers that felt familiar, even though I had never met them. Subsequent trips were far more like, I'm going to take some time. I'm going to go to Ashrafiyya. I'm going to go up north and visit some friends. My father wanted me to see his hometown of Bint Jbal, and I went down there to visit, even though, I've family in the Nabatiyya, so I was able to stay down there for a little bit. But it was, at first it was quite jarring.
I bet it was. So let's come back to the United States for a bit, and we're going to encounter Lebanon over and over again. But back in the United States, so you grew up obviously within an Arab community, very strong, but you also grew up as practicing Muslim. Your mom obviously is practicing, your dad, I assume, was practicing as well.
Yes.
And so what was that like growing up in America as a Muslim?
Very commonplace, very, as I was saying, I watch a lot of content, especially Muslim-centric content now. And the story is, we are Muslim and everyone around us is not. And so what is that experience of, owning your faith when people around you are not? And that just was not the experience. I almost really didn't know my faith until I was able to leave that enclave, because I only knew what everybody else was doing. But it really wasn't until after September 11th, 2001, when the majority of my non-Muslim communities, from my academic world or just friends of mine in New York, really looked to me to answer a lot of questions. And at the time, I was very, very, I found it to be an honor to be able to be a representative in that capacity, because everything I was seeing in the media looked nothing like the experience that I had growing up. I remember during the month of Ramadan, when I was in school in Ann Arbor, I would sort of pack people into my car very late at night. We would drive 35 minutes to Dearborn to the bakeries that were open. And so people were like looking at me like, this is incredible, unlike what they were seeing projected back to them in the media. That said, I found the individuality. I found the specificity of my Islam really in a post 9/11 world. It made me more drawn to and held on to the tenets of my faith that were just sort of inherently ingrained in me growing up.
And what would those tenets be that you sort of became more attached to?
Warm and inviting, accepting of people, accepting of the world, generosity, empathy, just all of the things that just were so commonplace in a town like Dearborn, or culturally relevant to the things that were happening while I was growing up, whereas things that were being talked about in the media, words that have never left my mouth, the T word, the difference between Sunni and Shia, like these were not things I ever even began to think about in thinking of my faith from a socio-political point of view. There was no socio-political point of view growing up because we were just all doing what we do. It was not uncommon that in school, people were skipping the lunch line and fasting because we were all doing it. So there was just sort of, there wasn't a need to explain it.
It makes a lot of sense. I think that's, again, a common experience that you would see with a lot of folks. So I'm glad you spoke about that. So let's talk a little bit about the beginning of your career. You said when you were in high school, you came to your mom and dad and said, I really would like to be in musical theater. And their, first reaction was a flying flip-flop. And the next one was, okay, how are we gonna live with this one?
Yeah.
So, but what really sort of stoked your interest in it? What really kind of compelled you in that direction as a young teenager?
When I was, so up until 8th grade, I went to one set of schools with all of my friends. When high school came around, we had moved in the summer in between 8th and 9th grade, which put me in a different district. So going into high school, I didn't know most of the kids that were there. And also it was a far more, the west side of Dearborn at the time was far more white than it was Arab, unlike the east and south ends of Dearborn. So my high school counselor was like, hey, you need another credit. I'm going to put you in choir. I was like, oh, okay. We were doing choir in 8th grade, no big deal. And there was a girl and she was like, you going to audition for the school musical? And I was like, no, but are you? And she was like, yeah. And I was like, all right, so am I then. And I auditioned and I did that show in my freshman year of high school, and the local newspaper shouted me out as being like a standout on stage. And I think from there I was like, oh, who is that girl? I don't care. I just want all of this attention and clapping and all these things. That was like, oh God, this feels great. And from then on, my high school theater director really took a really active interest in me and saw something in me, and was very nurturing, and was really the one who said, hey, you should consider the University of Michigan. They have a really respected musical theater program, and only one of 10, they only accept 10 men of thousands of applicants a year. And when I got in, I think my parents were like, it's like not a doctor, but sounds pretty cool. I mean, we got to figure this out. So, and I really did think up until probably my junior year of high school that I would go to medical school. I really was going to be a doctor. I don't know. I'm not going to pretend like they were like, great, hon, you're going to shine on Broadway. It was really tough. They might, there was like, empty threats of not paying for college, and just sort of all these things that they just, that happens when you're afraid of something you don't know. And ultimately, I think everybody just kind of, I wore everybody down, and they think, and then now, now I alhamdulillah, I'm very happy that I have a very stable career in entertainment, and I'm not exactly in the field that I graduated in, but it's all adjacent and it's all related. And my father now loves to say, we always knew, and even though even when I remind him of how he didn't know, he's like, I don't know what you're talking about, we always knew. But that's all right, all's well that ends well.
I mean, I think that it's a wonderful story, but it certainly is true that every good Arab boy, at least in my generation, and I assume in your generation, was supposed to be a doctor or engineer. So let me ask the so obvious question: did your three brothers? You have three brothers.
There are two sisters and a brother.
Did they go into engineering and medicine?
My eldest sister is a lawyer. My brother was an athlete turned financial consultant, and my younger sister is in education, was a teacher for many years, and now is on the administration side.
Okay, so everybody's in a profession though. So that's sorry. Anyway, so all right. So you started out. You went to Michigan, and that was the first step out of the enclave of Dearborn.
Yeah.
The very kind of both really comforting and enfolding, but sometimes smothering.
Totally. Yes.
The smothering embrace of any kind of enclave, not just because
Yes.
any kind of enclave becomes like that. So you arrive in Michigan, and all of a sudden there's a different world. You are for the first time a minority, an ethnic minority, a religious minority.
Yes.
So tell us a little about your experience there, and then where you took it. And what
it was in a lot of ways, and I'm not. I mean, I'm older, but I'm not that old. But in a lot of ways, it was the first time I had met a gay person was when I went to college. The first time that I had met girls who could, sort of date, and boys who could date and talk about that freely. And, it was just a sort of a different mentality of people that I was like, are your parents okay? Are you in trouble a lot? I would be a little embarrassed to tell my family who my friends were, because what is that okay? Am I allowed to be friends with? It was just a lot of newness and a lot of new things. But it worked out. What really really kind of changed for me was ultimately 4 years later when I moved to New York, I met a very large, prominent community of Arabs, most of whom were not Muslim. They were Lebanese Christian, Palestinian Christian Arabs. And so when I was fasting and they weren't, I was like, this is weird to be around all these Arabs who aren't doing the thing that I'm doing, because growing up, all the Arabs would do what I did. So it's just, as for all people, as people grow up and meet and experience things outside of their world, it's just, it's crazy that it took so long for me to meet a diversity of nuanced people.
Well, I think I don't know that it's atypical. I think all of us usually take a time to come out of our little comfort zone.
Yeah.
Some challenge and change in the process. So the New York period, was that a period in which you were involved in musical theater, or were you beginning to experiment with film at that time?
A little of both, mostly musical theater. I was there with musical theater in my eyes and in my heart, and I worked a lot in the theater while I was there. And it wasn't until there were some opportunities here and there that were in the film and TV space. So I sort of dipped my toes then. And it wasn't until I left and came back to New York that I got heavily involved in film, which ultimately got my move out to LA.
So in the early period, when you're beginning to sort of explore film, roles in film production, was this something that were these sort of the stereotypical Arab Muslim man roles, or were you allowed to break out of that and not be the cliche that people wanted to imagine Arabs and Muslims are?
I vividly remember after, in a post 9/11 world, the roles that were afforded to people, brown people of color, Muslim, Arab, Middle Eastern, Manasa, actors and actresses, was very either let's lean into the stereotype, or let's like create something new. And people kind of fell in and out of, or in either one of those camps. And I, very early on, I sort of pride myself in having never been having to make the decision to play any of those stereotypical roles. Anything that I wanted to do was like a greatly specific and around a very specific experience. So, you know, I never was going in for hijacker number 4 who was screaming obscenities. That was never going to be me. I think also if I did, people would have laughed. But also it was just not me. And, you know, I think amongst that community, there was great discussion around, you know, some people got to pay the bills, they got to eat, they got to, you know, they're trying to sort of edge their way up into the industry in their own way. And there were others who were like, absolutely not, that's not for me. I was in the latter camp. But you know, but it depended on sort of what you were ultimately looking to do.
What were you looking ultimately to do?
You know, I knew that my identity was a way into the industry and a way for me to tell the kinds of stories that I wanted to tell that were not yet reflected back to me in a lot of ways. But I wanted a bigger and a broader kind of career. I wanted the ability to dip into a lot of different kinds of projects. So I think I've always been a little conscious of how it's easy to get pigeonholed. So I always wanted to make sure there was an angle that could never be associated with another angle.
You from New York, what year did you go to Los Angeles? When did you finally move there?
2011, 10 years ago.
10 years ago. So it's shortly after that you made Breaking Fast as a short film.
Yes, as a short film. Yes, And
was Ubuntu before that or after that?
No, after. Everything was after Breaking Fast, the short. That was truly the very first scripted project that I endeavored to do. The big thing that came before it was All American Muslim.
Okay, so I'll come back to All American Muslim in a bit because I think that's a very interesting story. But I actually am very curious because in some ways, it seems to me, and I might be completely wrong, so please correct me if I am, that the short, you know, Breaking Fast created a trajectory in which you're dealing with incredibly, you know, important issues, but incredibly controversial issues, and you're dealing with them so eloquently and so carefully in such a nuanced way that the humanity of everybody is never disappears. I mean, you don't go the sort of the low road of making jokes about the obvious, you know, the low-hanging fruit of, you know, the white Anglo person, but you're dealing with somebody who's gay, Muslim, Arab, who is, you know, crossing out of the small bubble. They're not born. The All American Muslim is about folks in Dearborn, but this is not. And Brothers, to a certain extent, I think, is also not really. It's a little bit more than Bring Fast. So I'm kind of curious the trajectory that led you to that moment in which you said, okay, this is what I really want to talk about.
Yeah.
What is it that compelled you to do the short and then, of course, now the feature film, both of which are award-winning?
I appreciate that. Thank you. The two are not the All American Muslim and Breaking Fast are very much related because while All American Muslim, and we can get into the specifics of that show later, do take place in Dearborn, the impetus for why it existed was because, as I had touched on earlier, the Arab American and or the Muslim American experience that was being projected in the media at that point never looked like the experience that was mine in Dearborn, in that enclave, in that really sort of Venn diagram of culture, ethnicity, faith, and nationality. So and on the Breaking Fast side, the same was true, right? The reason why Breaking Fast ever came about was I was asked a simple question one day by a friend of mine, who best represents you or your experience in film and television? And the reality was I didn't have a real answer. I didn't know who or what I could point to. And he said, you should write it. And I did. It was the first time I'd ever endeavored to write something. And so, for me, it was, again, an opportunity to say, well, this is not new to me. This is mundane. This is everyday to me. But for some reason, people, the general sense of people, don't get to see this perspective. Again, the same was true for All American Muslim, and so what I was hoping to do with Breaking Fast was to actually say, look, I totally get that everybody has their own points of view on how this story should go, but let me at least tell you a version of the story that exists for not just for myself. It's not an autobiographical story, but it's definitely touches upon stuff that has happened to me and to my friends and to people that were every day living a life where there wasn't the need to sit in question whether or not who they loved in life dictated whether or not they could have a relationship with God. And so, and again, I think everything that I do, everything that I've done up to this point has been about saying, somebody else has been telling you one version of the story. I'd love to tell you my version of the story as well. And we can debate about it, we can talk about it, but it doesn't take away from the reality of my version, because my version is a lived one.
I'm going to ask you about the response to Breaking Fast and, the All American Muslim in a bit. But really, what I've really found inspiring and really quite remarkable is that every category you deal with that are this kind of Venn diagram of personality, gay, Arab, Muslim, could be kind of a lead-in to a very alienating existence. I mean, being gay in a, let's say in an Arab community that is not terribly accepting of LGBTQ could be alienating. Being Arab and Muslim in a white dominant society in America, not only white dominant, but racism against both Arabs and Muslims could be very alienating. But you chose something very different rather than to talk about the alienation, although I think you do acknowledge it, by the way. I mean, you could see it in the pain that appears every now and then on Mo's face, which I found to be an incredibly beautiful performance. You kind of turn it inside out, in which you are not only claiming space, but you're claiming to belong everywhere, and that you are kind of pushing against this kind of alienation to create space. And I'm really interested I mean, I think you alluded to this, but I mean, again, I found that to be so powerful and empowering that I'm really curious how you kind of flip the script. What is it that made you say, wait a minute, I don't have to accept the script, I want to flip it.
Sorry.
No, please go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, first of all, I want to absolutely acknowledge that my ability to stand before you or anyone else and say, hey, I know that you think this story is X, but let me tell you it's Y, is a huge privilege. I stand in a huge place of privilege with the ability to say that, the ability to not have to mute parts of myself, the ability to be surrounded by a loving and accepting chosen family, etc. That to me, I have to, start by saying, I understand that I am oversimplifying the dichotomy of what we're discussing. That said, I think, for me, all I can tell you is everything we know about it, everything that you've described as being sort of contradictory or controversial is in fact true for some, and for others not. For others, it is merely mundane existence. And so I think all I'm saying is, so let's also just let's just look at this side of it too. Not that this is the side, the only side, the right side, but just that if we're going to tell stories that are nuanced, The Muslim community is not a monolith. The Arab community is not a monolith. The LGBTQ community is not a monolith. All I can tell you is one version of that story, taking those three identities, how they relate to one individual character. In Breaking Fast, we have three Arab, Muslim, LGBT, or gay men, all of whom have a very different relationship to those identities. And we have sort of a triangulation among them, very specifically, because I would hate for somebody to walk away from Breaking Fast and say, oh, I guess all those people who are in torment are actually wrong. Everything is just fine, because obviously everything is not fine. But for some people, everything is fine. And so we're sort of just showing that there is a variety in which to tell these kinds of stories. And I think for me, that's important. You know, I have lived through my own sadness and pain and trauma, and I have found the other side of it, mostly because of my relationship with God. There are those who don't have that luxury, don't have that privilege. There are those who have to mute an entire part of themselves to live a singular kind of life. And I just think there should be room to tell all kinds of stories. I don't even know if I answered your question.
You did. No, absolutely. I think, Mike, listen, just very eloquently, you answered the question, and it's absolutely true. And I would like to add also that, I mean, this idea of multiple ways in which people can experience the same category, identity, what have you. But even the same person can go through life and at various phases will have a different relationship with that. That could be positive, negative, or mix, or what have you. So I completely acknowledge and I agree with what you're saying. I think it's the fluidity of the process and
Correct.
you know, the multiplicity of the situation that is very true. But let's talk a little bit about reaction to the film. I'm kind of curious, both within the heritage community, however one kind of talks about the heritage community, the LGBTQ is one, obviously the Arab community is another, slash Lebanese, and finally the Muslim community. So I'm kind of curious how people have responded to that, to the film, both the short and the feature one.
Okay. Oof, lots to talk about. The shorts, the reason why the feature exists at all is because the reaction to the short was, we want more, what happens next? Festival audiences really embraced the film. You know, the short was never intended to be expanded. It was a short. It was going to live on its own. A fan of the short introduced the short to somebody who loved it and ultimately became the anonymous funder of the feature. And so, you know, it sort of spawned a whole life of its own and then became the feature version, which too has a life of its own. I will tell you, for every obvious low-hanging fruit kind of reaction you might suspect would come from a rom-com about a gay Muslim man living in West Hollywood during the month of Ramadan, for everyone that like we can just imagine, I promise you, we consistently still to this day receive 10 times, thank you. You created an opportunity for me to talk to my mother. You helped me really understand my son. We've been estranged for many years. We didn't have the words. We now have the words. So there is so much of the positive for me that I don't ever want to sort of, I don't want to ignore or bright side the negative, right? That definitely exists, and people are, I don't know many other faiths where like one, like I you know, there's one comment that sticks out to me in particular, and someone, I think, I don't know where at this point I stopped reading the comments, but somebody said, I would rather a movie about terrorists than about this. And again, I think to myself, that speaks volumes about you. Like that says, like that unto itself tells me what you think of yourself, less what you think of the movie that we made. I don't care anymore. But you know, for every one of those, I would rather sit in a room and talk to the 5 and 10 times the amount of positive reactions You know, it is, this film exists. I mean, like, I'm not trying to be like weird when I say this. The trajectory of a film like this, a niche, small, independent film like this existing in a mainstream marketplace on a mainstream streaming platform is truly an act of God. Like and for those who don't know the deep nuance of like how movies get onto distribution platforms, etc., like it is an act of God. And so much of making this film was an act of God, you know, even as I alluded to how we found our funding. So I've never once said, God, should we have done this? Was this the wrong choice? It has never crossed my mind once. It has cost me some things that I think in the end, I look back and I say, I don't know what that word is, but you know, when like, you know, like it's like the cost of something is like you lost something is the cost. I don't know. Anyway, what I'm trying to say, I guess what I'm trying to say is like I've never doubted that making and putting this film into the world wasn't exactly what we should have done.
I completely have to agree, because I think the film is just a remarkable piece of filmmaking, first and foremost. I mean, I think
That's so
aside
kind
from
of you. Thank you.
all the you know, categories that one can sort of put it in, I think as a film, as an art form, it's just absolutely brilliant. And it's very tightly, the script is very tightly done. And it's very amusing. It's a comedy you actually do, and it's heartwarming. And it's really very powerful and effective. And I'm kind of curious, is if the film has had any screening in the Middle East yet. I mean, I'm kind of curious.
Not yet. Not yet. And we're hoping that it will. Couple the short has, and Brothers, another short film of mine, have both to much success, and also in India, huge in India. And Breaking Fast was in India. The feature was in India, but not yet. We actually just in the last few months have been selling to international territories. We're going to come out in France, in Greece, in Taiwan, in the next coming months here. And I think once it is in the ether of the international community, it will sort of start to spread. But we certainly would embrace it. We would love it. You know, I think it would be really important for the film to be screened there. Now, with, you know, with controversy that we're seeing with Eternals, and the representation of Arab gay characters, I don't know if the film would be welcome there, but you know what, if somebody wanted to welcome it, we'd be more than happy to screen it.
Just kind of out of curiosity, with the films that you say Taiwan and Greece, are these being subtitled? They're not dubbed. This is all subtitling.
They'll be subtitled, correct? Yes.
I mean, I think for those of our audience who are not necessarily familiar with the modern Middle East very much, or certainly there is a very important LGBTQ community and culture that within the Middle East that dates back all the way to the medieval times and beyond. It's a very thriving culture. It's only recently that we see in the Middle East, in modern nation states, horrendous crackdown on LGBTQ. But it's important to note that in the 19th century and before, it was celebrated with poetry within religious and outside religious circles. And I say that because I want to move away from the stereotype. And there's, you know, LGBT communities throughout the Middle East. Some of them obviously have to be underground, but some of them are not. And I think that's also very important to keep in mind. And I think this film would be welcome in many different ways by those who are members of that community and otherwise.
I love that you said that. That's so beautiful what you just said.
Well, I mean, I think it's very important for us to acknowledge that, because I think there's the stereotyping continues to go on. And, you know, I think pushing LGBTQ community out of the history of the modern Middle East is just simply re-emphasizing the oppression that they may find in modern times. But
fantastic.
But I have a student from NC State who has asked a question. I want to give her space, and then when I go back to All American Muslim, because that predates everything. And I found that to be an incredibly engaging and fascinating conversation there. All right, so this is a student, as I said, her name is Trista, and she wants to know, when you went to Lebanon for the first time, did you feel out of place, or was it familiar because you had been around a lot, the Lebanese diaspora in Dearborn? So I mean, again, back to this whole notion about where you fit and where you don't fit.
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you, Trista. I would say both. I mean, I would say that, my Arabic is fine for a first generation person from Dearborn, Michigan. People love to compliment me on it, and then I go to Lebanon and people would prefer I spoke English and, don't understand what I'm saying. And that's my own fault. But I think there were spaces where, it was home. It was home. Family was home. People I had not met, I felt like I had known for my whole life. And then there were other times where, it really, I did feel a little bit like a fish out of water at times. Mainly because I think, as an American-born Arab, my impressions of Lebanon or the Middle East, but Lebanon in specific, are the impressions that I'm told by my parents who have not lived there in a long time, the impressions that the media is feeding to me. So again, I'm walking into sort of uncharted territories without really having like a, I could take you I can take you to Dearborn right now and I can walk you through all that I know of Dearborn. But I was actually recently just there over a weekend, and I even in Dearborn, I felt a little out of place because the town has changed so much in the, 10, 12 years that I've lived there.
Yeah, I think a couple comments about that. First of all, for those of you who also are participating tonight, Mike's Arabic is actually quite fluent. And he speaks Lebanese very well with a southern Lebanese accent, which I love because I grew up in South Lebanon, and Labati, the town that he knows. So I'm very much partial to that as well. But second, quite honestly, Mike, I think whenever I was born and raised in Lebanon, and whenever I go back to Lebanon, I still feel out of place. I mean, like what you just said about Dearborn, this is just part of, being out of a place, and you go back and things have changed, and especially in a place like Lebanon where they keep, at least until recently, changing the landscape or the urban scape every 5 minutes, with buildings and disorient completely. And it's really funny because I think that's a very common phenomenon with the children of immigrants and immigrants themselves. After they go for a while, they go back, they think Lebanon is kind of frozen in its space. And then of course, Lebanon itself has changed. And I think that becomes a interesting thing. There was a very interesting film made about that actually in Lebanon. All right, so let's go back to the All-American Muslim. So this precedes all of this, and we're running close to our closing time, but I do want to get to this.
God, that went fast.
I know, and listen, I think we can go on for another hour, and I wouldn't satisfy my curiosity and my admiration for the work that you do. But All-American Muslim precedes all of this. So I'm kind of curious about how it came about as a show.
Yep.
I don't know if you pitched it or you were approached about it, and what was the intent of the show? I mean, obviously it's a reality show based on 5 families. Is that right? 5 families. 5
families. That's correct. Yeah.
And showing a diversity of people. For those of you again who haven't watched it, there are all sorts of YouTube clips that you can watch. One of my favorite there is the one where they go into the restaurant and the waitress is
throws the menus on the table.
Is the experience in that regard. And so anyway, so could you please tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. All-American Muslim, actually, just last week, we held a 10-year anniversary reunion panel with some of the cast, which is available on YouTube if anyone is interested. It's really fascinating to revisit the show and to revisit them. The show came about because it's both I pitched and both TLC was looking. One thing that was going on was TLC was looking for a sister companion piece to their show Sister Wives. So they wanted the same kind of show in the Muslim space. They tried to penetrate Dearborn, but like a lot of smaller towns, we are not really welcoming of strangers. So, they didn't have a lot of success. People didn't want to talk to them. And also understandably so, this was a medium that was not generally good to Arab and or Muslim depictions. So there was obviously some mistrust there. And I totally understand that. I was working a job. I was hired as a field producer on a show, and the executive producer of that show said, hey, I think TLC is looking to do something in Dearborn. And she was able to set me up with a meeting with them. And they said, hey, bring us some subjects and we'll talk there. So I went back home. I rounded up my first cousin. I rounded up my buddy from kindergarten and the football coach at, and just all these people that were like, what do you want to do, Mike? Yalla, let's do it. Okay. Like, it was like totally just like chaos. And I went back to TLC and I said, here's a profile of 5 families of varying religiosity and a spectrum of faith and cultural practice. And they said, you know what, let's make the show. And the show was greenlit in May. And in June, we had 3 weeks to prep before we jumped into our first day of filming, which was one of the participants' wedding was on July 3rd, which is unheard of in the world of development, to jump into production 3 weeks later. And so then we shot, 7-10 days of a pilot, cut that, and then TLC greenlit the rest of the episodes. And unfortunately, look, I would say that most of the criticism of All American Muslim, although it was critically acclaimed in a lot of ways and hugely helpful in shaping my career, a lot of the criticisms were very merited in the lack of diversity on the show. These were almost entirely Lebanese, Shia, Muslim, Arabs from one town. There was not the spectrum of the Muslim American experience that we see in this country. But also, I am Shia, Lebanese, Muslim from Dearborn, and I had a platform and I had the opportunity to tell the story that I knew. What I wished would have happened was this would have been the stepping stone. And in a lot of ways, it is the stepping stone for a lot of subsequent Muslim-centric content that we see, for people to tell all sorts of Muslim stories, because as I said early on, of course, we are not a monolith. As Arabs, we are not a monolith. But I love doing the show. It was so stressful to produce Your Friends. And in the end, here we are 10 years later, talking about it with great fondness and a little PTSD.
I would love to share the link to the YouTube of that. So if you have it, please drop me now or later, and I can send it to our viewers via email, because I'm sure many would love to see that as well.
Sure, I'll send it around.
So with the show was 1 season, from what I understand. Is that correct?
Yes.
And was it the decision of TLC to stop it, because it seemed like it could go on for many seasons, like a lot of reality shows?
Yeah, it ultimately was the network's decision. I think 10 years ago we were living in a very different landscape. And I think some business decisions were made, and unfortunately, the show was on the chopping block for a lot of those reasons. There was some controversy with Lowe's pulling their advertisements from the show, which I think there were like a lot of things. I'll tell you, I think if the show existed today, in some iteration, it would be around for a very long time.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, the time, 10 years have made a huge difference.
Yeah.
I think you're absolutely right at that point. So when you were making the show, I know it's, family and friends that you rounded up, and I completely understand that. When we did our first, documentary at the center, it is snowball, connections, this person knows that person.
Yeah.
And of course that creates its own self-selection, and I understand the limitations of that, but at the same time, given the shortness of time, you had limitations you had to deal with. So I actually completely understand where you're coming from. But I'm kind of curious, when you were representing this, what was in your mind, what were you trying to get across to the larger American audience beyond Dearborn and beyond the Muslim audience?
Yeah, totally. I think it sort of all circles back to that very first thing we were talking about, which is that, that fish out of water story is not, in fact, the story of Dearborn. That story of Dearborn is one of great Americana infused with rich cultural and religious homogeny. And it was a story of how you find the nuance, how you find the individuality within that homogeny, because I think, you know, just because all of those people are Lebanese and are all Muslim and are all from Dearborn, here's 5 families living five very different experiences, and all going back to that Venn diagram, all of those intersectional moments. So I think that was kind of the big impetus, was like, on one hand, we are, as a humanity, we are so much more alike and can find commonalities amongst ourselves, but also all Arabs, all Muslims are not built and made the same. We all come from a huge background.
We do. We indeed do. I'm going to end with a couple questions. One is, I would like for you to perhaps tell us a little bit more about where your next projects are going. They don't have to be very specific, but I'm kind of curious more about the themes or the thematic. Is it going to be continuation or breaking fast? Are you, sorry to use the same language, breaking away from breaking fast? Which direction are you going? What is the next stage in terms of your own personal development as an artist, as a filmmaker, as a producer and director, and actor?
Yeah.
So that's question number one.
Okay.
If I may ask question number two, it's not necessarily, it's related, but necessarily it's a larger context. I'm kind of curious about where you see Arab American filmmaking going in the future as a whole.
So in terms of my own slate at the moment, yes, there's some of the same, and yes, there's some new things. I mean, we have been approached about the development of Breaking Fast into a TV series. So we have been sort of noodling over that and figuring out what a TV series looks like, which has actually been quite fun. So inshallah, that ultimately finds its way into the world. And I also have a couple of projects that I'm attached to direct and or produce, some of which are far different than anything I've ever done. One of which takes me back to my roots in musical theater, and is a half-hour musical comedy TV series about 4 women activists in New York, which I'm very excited about. One of whom is Muslim. And another one is a biopic, a true story of one of the people affiliated with the Black Lives Matters protests. So it's kind of a spectrum of work, but the theme that always emerges is identity. The theme that always we come back to is how the nuance of our identities, I feel like I said that word a lot, but you know what I mean, sort of makes up our very individual story. I also find a lot of my work revolving around family, not necessarily blood, but what makes up family and how we define that word. And then in terms of the landscape of Arab American filmmaking, I think we are living in unprecedented times. I think now more than ever, we have a voice, and we have people in decision-making positions who want to hear our voice. So if we have a story to tell, if you're sitting on an idea, a script, this is the time to get it out there. I also think you're seeing a time where Arabs are the decision makers in some capacity at the studio level, at the network level. You're seeing Arab storytellers, creatives finding their own voices and coming forward. I think that the best part of all of it is that what was, a very small community of people where there were only few, it's immensely growing. And so, those who are now just in school or just trying to find their voices now will have a great list of resources and people to turn to and say, hey, how did you do it? I want to do it too. How can we do this together? And I think that's kind of the beauty of it right now for me, is that I'm just seeing great synergies amongst Arabs in filmmaking. And that to me is that's the best part.
Thank you so much, Mike, for again taking the time to be with us tonight. I really could go on for another hour because I find your work to be absolutely inspiring,
Thank you.
as well as highly entertaining, which I think is very important. And our audience completely agrees. This has really been very important. So if you allow me, I'm going to conclude our evening by just turning once again to Turath. I'm going to share with you again where you can find the exhibit. So I think it's important if you, the exhibit, by the way, is both in English and in Arabic. We like to emphasize the bilingualism of our immigrant community and their heritage and their culture. So please, by any chance, if you want to take some time and go visit the exhibit, that would be great. Thank you again to our audience for being with us tonight. We know that it's just, these days we are all to a certain extent have Zoom fatigue, but your presence with us tonight is very much appreciated. And thank you for your questions that you shared. Once again, I'll do the, asking you to donate. Again, cultural productions of any nature, including this series of conversations that we've been hosting over the last year, requires funding. And so if you are so inclined, please take a moment and donate. And more importantly, if you go to our Turath exhibit, all of our webinars have been recorded. You can revisit some of the older conversations we've had. This conversation, we've of course will also be adding to that in the future. And with that, I would like to thank you all and thank Mike again very much and wish you all a very wonderful evening and a very good Thanksgiving holiday that's coming up next week. Good night. Take care.